Hello and welcome to Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction. We're really happy to be back for our 4th season. And on today's show, we have a special guest who we tried to get in last season and the season before, and we finally got him pinned down. Is Brandon Vecchiola, who is also a counselor. He's an advocate. He's doing a bunch of great things in the community. And on top of that, part of the reason why we have him here today is because he's a veteran. He's going to share some of that information with us. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
My pleasure. So I would love to talk about your experience as being a veteran, if you're okay. I just want to head right at it. And because this is obviously a show about addiction, it'd be great if we could talk about how those things intertwine in some of your experiences with doing that.
Sure, absolutely.
So why don't you give me a little bit of a snapshot of what it means to be a veteran and struggling with substance use disorders?
Sure, I guess I'll start with what it means to be a veteran.
Perfect.
Yeah, I joined the Army in 2004. I was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, super idealistic, and I really wanted to be part of something bigger than myself, some great cause. And so I joined the Army. I joined a reserve unit in Toronto, did that for a few years, and then the war in Afghanistan was ongoing at that time, and so I volunteered by the 2007. I had finished my trade training. I was a weapons technician. And so I began it was like a 2-year-long journey of training up for that deployment. And then I deployed to Afghanistan in 2008, 2009. Spent 7 months in theater, Kandahar Airfield, and in a forward operating base called Masumgar. From there, came back to Canada, stayed on what's called Class B reserve, basically being a full-time reservist for a few months. And then I transferred to the regular forces, where I spent the remainder of my career, which was a total of 12 years. Got out of the Army in 2015. So being a veteran for me means having spent a lot of time in the Army, 12 years, but also having deployed overseas. I know Veterans Affairs Canada and the government has different definitions, but for me, I consider myself a veteran because I actually served my country overseas. It was a huge endeavor for me as a young man. I was like 22 years old and off to see the world kind of thing. And feeling like I was really following in the footsteps of my predecessors who had served the country before me, who I grew up, admiring.
Of course.
Yeah. Now the second part, the substance use piece, this may come as a surprise to you or not, I don't know, but drinking culture in the military is huge. Right.
I'm surprised. Look.
Yeah, very surprised. Yes, very, very surprised. Yes.
I mean, just the media alone portrays it in that it's be active, fight, go to the bar after,
and work hard, play hard.
Yeah.
So it's an old tradition. I mean, it goes way back to the mess hall, which every military base has as a place where soldiers get to go. They have a bar built into every military establishment, and so. You'd finish training and you go to the mess hall and you have a couple beers. And so whatever that means to you. I'm
curious about the definition of mess hall because now the word mess is me thinking about
it's a disaster.
what drinking used to look like to me. I'd drink and that'd be a mess.
It's an old French word, actually. It comes from an old French word. I can't remember the exact definition, but it had to do with coming around a table, eating food and having drinks, and then sharing what had happened on the battlefield.
Oh,
yeah. So it's a really old tradition.
Well, I'll be googling that when I get out of here today.
Yeah, good. Yeah. And so that's where it began. It was a good time. Like you go to the mess and it's exciting, and everybody, especially before you go overseas, and everybody's super excited. There are lots of young soldiers, privates, full of.
Piss and vinegar.
Piss and vinegar.
There we go. Yeah.
Full of piss and vinegar, and just really on an adventure, right? And so the drinking culture gets built into it, and then it does or can become problematic over time, right? And for me, there was an excitement about that culture, right? I loved being in the Army. I loved being a soldier. I loved the people who I was becoming comrades with, and working together and drinking and playing together was fun. It was a great time. There was a transition at some point, though, in between being a new soldier training for Afghanistan and coming back, where drinking wasn't just about the connecting, it wasn't just about the coming together and sharing stories. It became about just moderating, right, the emotional experience that I was having. And it was a good tool. It was a very good tool. I mean, alcohol is a numbing effect. It's a soothing intoxicant, right? It's a depressant. Yeah. And when you're anxious and you're worked up, or you've come off an X and you're super hyped up, or you come back from overseas and you're still really activated. It's a great tool to help alleviate.
That's the problem, is it is a good tool, right?
Yeah, it's an excellent tool. Yeah. And in place, if you don't have any other skill sets, which at the time I didn't have many.
Well, you were 22,
23.
22 when you started, and so I mean, I don't see. I think today, when you said 22, my brain kind of went, wow, because we think now in today's terms, it's we recognize people aren't technically adult in their emotional stance and their brain development until they're 25, and now we look at it from a different. Saying that at 22 you're making a decision to dedicate your life to something like that is like, whoa.
It's a huge decision. I mean, and young people are very impressionable and idealistic and looking for something to give themselves to, right? And so that mixed in with some more brain development, right? Like the ability to make decisions gets hampered. And you add alcohol to that, and then your decision-making capability as a young person. Then you add stress.
And what about so you talked about the camaraderie and stuff, but what about the peer influence? I mean, we try not to blame it that it's all peer influence, or we say it's it's because of the people you hang around with. But when you're that age and you're impressionable, this is what everyone's doing. Yeah,
I'd say there's peer influence for sure, but there wasn't like the sergeant was holding me down and like trying to get me to funnel beers or whatever, right? Like the
you funnel beers all by yourself.
Yeah, I was a willing participant. No, it really did revolve around that building of community. Really the early drinking, and that's what it's used for in the wider society too. It's the social lubricant, right? Have a couple beers, you loosen up, you can connect and talk, and you're more fluid, right? And that's fine.
Yeah, I recognize it more in the sense of, and to use a bigger word, belonging, right? And seeing that not so much of a peer influence as if I have to do this, but the underlying part of it is to say I doing it because of my own accord, but from an underlying thing, it's like I have to do it to belong as well.
Yeah, there's some of that for sure. Okay. Yeah, and I think a lot of it, if I think back to some of the courses I did, it was a release. Too, like you're up at 4, you're in bed at 11 all day long. It's activity after activity, training event after training event. Like super exciting, adrenaline raising thing happening. You're throwing grenades, or you're shooting a machine gun, or you're leading some patrol, and you've been up for 13 hours, and you just did something incredible that you didn't think that you could do. Then that course comes to an end, and it's sort of like a celebration. Right, it's like a celebration of all of the cool things that you just did. It's a celebration of the tenacity and the grit it took to make it through that. It's a celebration of the community that develops around doing really, really hard stuff together. Sure. And then it's a release too of the tension of having to perform for those prolonged periods of time.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned it, being a depressant and a central nervous system depressant. So I would imagine being in a escalated or agitated state for a prolonged period of time, that would totally be.
Yeah, and they're not like, okay, troops, we just did a 6-week X, let's all get together and do a meditation. let's bring it down a notch. No, it's not happening. Right, it's not happening.
No.
And especially in my generation, like there was talks at the time of, like when I was deploying overseas, because there had been a couple rotations and some really intense combat action prior to us going overseas, we got like mental health briefs. Yeah. But there wasn't a lot of skills development. There wasn't a lot of time spent like, okay, let's work on grounding, let's work on meditation, let's work on it was all sort of like in the background.
Okay.
And now, as I understand it, there's more push towards in basic training even. Okay, here's some tools, here's some skills, here's some resources. Like everybody's aware now in the wider culture too.
Can you shine a little light on what a mental health brief is and what that looks like?
What that was?
Is it brief?
I mean, I use that term. Maybe it came in they might have actually called it that, but I don't remember the exact term. But one memory comes to mind is when we were on pre-deployment training. They brought the company in to a hall, and there was some retired soldier. I believe he was a warrant officer who had experienced intense combat action, let's say overseas, and as a result developed an operational stress injury, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Are these the same thing?
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, so an operational stress injury is a term that the Army uses to catch all different types of mental health occurrences that can result from theater. Okay. So post-traumatic stress disorder is just one of them.
And this is only theater? Sorry, I'm
no,
bombarding you.
No, it's okay. It's not just in theater.
Clarity.
No, soldiers do develop mental health disorders as a result of service in Canada.
Other service.
I mean, there's all kinds of different situations where stress arises, not just in Afghanistan, but that's my well of experience.
Okay.
So that's why I keep going to that.
Perfect.
And so they discussed what is post-traumatic stress disorder, what is an operational stress injury, how does it occur over time, like how do they occur? Do they occur suddenly, or is there a progression, and what is stress? And I remember them telling us about, they used the analogy of a rising scale. They used a visual image. It was like a line chart, basically a line graph, where you have a stressful event, and your stress levels get really high, but then it drops back down, and then maybe you get in a car accident, and then you recover from that, and maybe you have a divorce, and then you recover from that, and then you go overseas, and now your baseline stress level is all the way up here when it started here, and that's when post-traumatic stress disorder kicks in. That's when you start having operational stress injuries. That's when anxiety and depression become seriously problematic, and substance use kicks in as a way to deal with the now normal for you, which is hypervigilant, right?
So the briefing is more of a psychoeducational group, like it's not an interaction or where we get some counseling or whatever, or talk in any in-depth. It's just here's some early warning signs and here's what it looks like, and hopefully you'll seek help if it's too late, if you're over here.
Yeah, they say here's some resources. Back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Okay. Well, I mean that's
it's something.
It's something. Yeah. But we also look back and say that's been socially acceptable for a really long time in every industry, in every place. It's just been like, here's some more information. We've done our due diligence. Now let's carry on. And
they also had lived experience peers come in and tell their personal story, but that was much later. That was I remember that was after deployment, and I had joined the regular Army by then, and this is years later. I'm getting more information because I think at that time the Army had recognized that mental health had become a huge issue for them post-Afghanistan, and so they started pouring more resources in, because there were still a lot of soldiers in the Army who had served in Afghanistan who were had not yet released, but were experiencing mental health issues.
What about? It makes me think about the post event or post theater, and you see a lot of things on TV where you see groups where there's veterans all have like a veterans, they all get together and they sit in a room and talk, something like a 12-step meeting, and they get together. Is this something that is encouraged or noted through the process of saying here's one of the resources as to? Yeah.
So there is something called the Operational Stress Injury Clinic that the Canadian Army started. A retired Canadian colonel named Stéphane Grenier pioneered that program within the Canadian Forces. He actually wrote a book, I believe it's called Surviving the War.
Okay.
There was a peer support network in place, but part of the culture of being in the military is you don't talk about it. It's not, we're not going to talk about it. Just carry on, right? Like suck it up, suffer in silence. It was literally something they taught me on, like my instructors were like on basic training. It was like, we're like, are we going to do those army chants like we see in the movies? And they're like, no, we suffer in silence. It's like, all right.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's hard to inculcate a new culture around mental health in an organization that's been operating like that for hundreds of years. Right?
Yeah.
So while those systems were in place, it takes time for that to actually work its way into the culture.
And I got so many more questions, but I'm going to have them right after this break. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Brandon of Vecchiola. Welcome back to Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction. And on today's show, we've got Brandon Vecchiola. Brandon, right before the break, you were talking about suffering in silence. And I think that's a really big thing to talk about, and how the suffering in silence would impact mental health and or trauma from your perspective as a counselor and a veteran. Also, I would think that within that military complex, we'll call it, there's a necessity in suffering in silence. Like, there's a part of it that says, in order to get you to do the things you have to do, there's part of it that says that's a necessary thing to happen. So I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on that, and what that means for mental health and both being active in the military.
Sure. I think you correctly identified that there is a necessity for it in an environment like that. There are, any given day, there'd be there's circumstances and situations where you just you have a job to do, right? Like I have to go to the World 3 Combat Hospital, and I have to assist with a massive casualty situation, and then maybe the next day I have to begin an operation and stay up for the next 36 hours, making sure that all of the equipment is serviceable for the forces who are about to go out on an op. So that there's literally no time to debrief or to go talk to a counselor and furthermore, there's a lot of important things that need to get done. So the suffer in silence serves a function in that, this is a hard job. You knew it was a hard job when you took it. You can't anticipate how hard it's going to be, but you still have a job to do, and a very important one. People's lives are literally, in your hands, depending on how you perform, right? So, and
your own life.
Yeah, and my own life. That gets trained out of you.
Forget about my life.
No, it really is all about your buddies, right? It's not, you get taught on basic. It's more like if you're done on basic training and you got your stuff together and your buddy doesn't, you failed, right? Right. So So yeah, there's a necessity for, but of course there's downstream negative impacts, for everybody, right? Not everybody gets mental health disorders, and not everybody develops an operational stress injury, right? But many do. And so the impact of that is that it becomes really difficult later on when you're not in theater, like when I'm not actively operational, to sit down and have a conversation about, okay, what was that? How did that happen? Unless it's, around alcohol and we're in the mess hall, and then it's like it didn't happen, right? But of course, proper processing can occur when you're intoxicated. It just becomes well, at least not for me, it was an emotional mess.
Tell me more. So proper processing is a direct correlation to PTSD and trauma for, if proper processing doesn't happen, correct?
Yeah, so exactly. There's a stressful event that occurs, and you sort of need to put it. The thing with a traumatic experience is that it becomes fragmented in your memory, right? And so, this is what I know now from being a counselor. In order to properly process that event and put it away, you need to put it into a narrative. You need to stretch it out. It needs to make sense to you, because a lot of the big problem with those events is that they don't really make sense, right? And so it has to fit into the narrative of your life in a way where it doesn't stick out like a big sore. And so that requires, concentrated, conscious effort in order to do that. There's brain processes at play there, but essentially alcohol or any other substance interferes with that process for the most part.
Sure.
There's research coming out that.
So for the audience to know that we've all had a few drinks and recognize how our memory gets shattered and fragmented, and even though we're talking it through, the narrative is broken up. It has different associations because my physical factors and my cognitive functions are delayed by the alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what happened for me is there were some things that I needed to process, right? And how I did that was through writing.
Very, very powerful.
Very
And
powerful
I constantly tell my clients, let's
Yeah.
get the pen and paper.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are resistant to it, but
Very
it's,
resistant.
It's such a necessary thing.
It's painful.
It is.
Yeah,
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable, and so that is the preferred method of processing is narrative writing. I mean, conversation helps a lot too, but the writing part I have found has been the most beneficial, and so that's when the culture of silence begins to lift. It's an internal shift first, right? It's like, can I actually stop now and take a look at this stuff, right? And I heard this great analogy. It was actually by an OPP sergeant, and he said, for the course of a career, things happen, and they become like pebbles, and you put them in your pocket, and then you end up with a pocket full of pebbles, and you carry them with you everywhere you go. But every once in a while, you take them out, and you put them out, and you look at them, and then maybe you don't have to put some of them back in your pocket, but you still have some sand. You still have some sand in the pocket from carrying the pebbles around. And it's that taking the pebbles out and looking at them to lighten the load. And if that is, like I said, the eradication of that culture of silence, suffering and silence, and then from that position where I've actually taken a look at all of the things that I'm carrying around, now I can start to talk about it. Now I have greater acceptance about it. Now I can fit it into the context of what actually happened in that place, what was going on there. And it's not just looking at my own experience, but then I take a look at the contextual factors. Right? What was that conflict about? What were some of the things that were going on in a wider sense? That how did I fit into that? Right. And so those are the kinds of things that help alleviate the suffering.
And I could see where, and from my experience talking about past events with lots of people, especially with substance use disorder, is a lot of it becomes internalized. Like, that's my fault. I did something wrong. Like, so that storytelling, does it help with being able to overcome some of that personalization and shame or whatever that might be associated with those events and those fragmented memories?
I think so. I think part of what I was talking about just then is the contextualizing the experience. It just removes it from it being such a personal event, right? It becomes more of a shared human experience.
I'm putting it out.
Yeah.
It's not mine and stuck in the space. It's out
Yeah.
here now. So it's something that can be a little more objective and not so subjective.
Yeah, like one of the things for me, for example, like I spent a lot of time in the combat hospital because I had a tactical combat casualty care course. So they would often call me to come do like different duties at the hospital. Not necessarily, I would be like, help with a mass cash, moving casualties around, providing security for the hospital. And in that environment, I was exposed to the same sorts of things that the nurses and combat doctors and trauma doctors
Not pleasant things to see.
No.
Yeah.
So in part of my processing, I studied that hospital. I learned about what was going on there. I learned about the medical innovations that were happening and all of the life-saving interventions that were developed as a result of that conflict. And that helped me really make more sense of what it was that I saw there, what was going on. And it turned down the dial on the less savory aspects of it and helped to give me a more balanced view of that entire event. And so, the pebble's out. I have some sand, but I'm not carrying around those stones anymore.
The pebble analogy is wonderful, and I use a similar one,
Yeah.
when talking with people. But it's most of the time we're not taking them out to look at them. We're walking around in life and we're putting more in our pocket. And we just keep adding to the load, and we're acting like, oh, my mom doesn't like me, and oh, this is my bosses, and I have this, and I just keep adding this load to being able to look at and spread it out. So I really enjoy that analogy and the idea of that. Now going into the hospital and look at it, most people, in the essence of dealing with something like this, it's usually the avoidance. It's like, I'm not looking at that pocket. I don't want to talk about that pocket. Is the thing. So I'd love to reflect a little bit more about the impacts of avoidance and what that looks like.
Well, you can't. In my experience, is you can't avoid your feelings selectively, right? Like I want to avoid thinking about this event. But then it's like, what else do I have to avoid thinking about in order to avoid thinking about that event?
But what do I have to do that?
Yeah,
I mean, to avoid an event. My brain is going to throw those things at me whether I'm there or not, or like it or not, right?
So, drinking was something. some use of substance to turn down the emotional affect. I think it's hard to, I think I just become less capable of feeling as a total human being.
Yeah.
Right. I can't, because you shut off some part of yourself that you don't want to look at, but in the process, I'm shutting down other parts of myself too. And why those events are so painful, the hospital scenes or whatever, is because I'm a human being. I care deeply. I feel. I love. I have compassion. These are humans suffering.
Yeah.
And that impacts you. It impacts anybody who's ever seen it, and being a human becomes painful, right?
Yeah.
But what I've come to understand is underneath that there's a deep love for the experience of living, for being alive, for being connected, And
but that becomes quite muted,
it becomes muted, right? And then because I don't want to touch that, you become angry, you become resentful,
become inhuman, and I don't
bitter.
feel. Yeah. I see that a lot, and I love this conversation. What I see, and I think a lot of people don't recognize, is the avoidance also then increases the sensitivity towards the issue, because the more I try not to look at it, when I do look at it, it's more painful because I'm avoiding the issue. 100%. It's like that, having a little callus on your hands is good, and then working in the garden, but if I avoid working on it, then all of a sudden one day I got to go, and it's harder, right? It's harder for me to do that work, so that's...
And there's a great relief that comes from looking at it. Right?
Yeah.
And because it does turn it up. If conflict avoided is conflict increased, right?
I agree. Yeah. So I could have this conversation all day with you. We're running out of time.
Sure.
I would love for you to touch base really super quick on Fight for Homelessness. I understand that you're doing something called Fight for Homelessness, and I would love for you to just talk about that really quick before we run out of time.
For sure. So the Fight to End Homelessness is a charity event that's happening in London. It's a charity boxing event, actually. And the Fight to End charity is raising money to help support Youth Opportunity Unlimited's building of a wellness hub called Jones Place. Cool. And this is going to be a wellness hub for new and expecting mothers who are young. And so they're going to have a place to go. There's going to be a number of beds in there, and they're going to try to help alleviate the homelessness burden for these young women who are experiencing homelessness. And it's super important to me because I didn't mention this at the beginning, but when I was born, my mom was in a precarious housing situation.
Oh, okay.
And my grandmother's name is Joan.
Oh, well, there you go.
So it's kind of personal.
It kind of hits there, right?
So the boxing event is on November 8th.
Oh, perfect.
I'll be fighting some business owner in the London community. I don't know who it is yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a...
I own a business. You never know.
I might be fighting.
Not me.
No, but we're training at Boomer's Boxing Gym. We go there every Tuesday and Thursday. It's a big community event.
Cool.
And everybody that's involved in it really, really cares about helping with the homelessness situation in London.
Fantastic.
And we're raising money for that. Well, there's boxing involved. It's about the charity. It's about getting the money to YOU to get those people a place to live.
Okay, great. Thank you for being on the show. I love what you're doing. It's fantastic stuff. We'll get something put on the bottom of the screen about the boxing match, and make sure you buy your ticket to see Brendan get punched in the face. I'm
going to be punching people in the face too.
Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for watching Invisible. We'll see you next time.